Hi, my name is Jack Soto. I'm the Senior Program Manager for Career Readiness and Employment. Thank you for joining us today. I will be trying to toggle between this screen and the other to see if there are any questions. So feel free to put them in the chat, and I will pause here in a little bit, maybe halfway through the presentation, to see if there are any questions. So thank you again. I am Navajo Kokapa. I work with the College Fund. I was born in Gallup, New Mexico, and grew up in Yuma, Arizona. And I have been working with the College Fund for about 8 years. Something I'll share about myself. Just as we think about this career path and what does that look like, or professional path, I could tell a bit of a story. I shared a story in the last session where we had we're about a team of 20 now or so, and we asked our team if just what their jobs were or what they wanted to be when they were growing up as children. And I shared that, there were only 2 of us out of the 20 that had an opportunity to do what it is that they wanted to do when they were younger. And I think that that's kind of telling, I guess, to some degree, because I don't know, how curious we are, or how pragmatic even if we are, and sort of thinking about what does a professional pathway look like for us when we're growing up. I wanted to be a restaurateur, and then I also wanted to work and be a firefighter. And I shared that I had been a forest firefighter for a number of years and enjoyed it. Had a little bit of a learning experience, but I found myself working with the U.S. Forest Service, because I was a forest firefighter, to talk a little bit about some of the things that were my takeaways when I was in that employment now, to fix some of the way that they work with people of color in their workforce and in their recruiting. And then I also shared that I wanted to own my own restaurant. Finally got to the point where I couldn't do it because I just didn't like people so much. So it just, and then I found my way into where I'm at now, which is in higher ed. Pretty much, I'll say policy, but, I work in a number of different ways, and trying to figure out, like, what does professional development look like for our students? What does it look like for Native people? How do we chat about this and think about this as cultural, in our cultural context, and sort of thinking about the future, and just sort of finding our way through the dialogue, just to know a little bit more about what it could mean for us when we think about supporting students and their trajectory for employment. So thank you for joining me today. I think, something I didn't add is that, in the makeshift, design of things, I traveled all over the country and worked in a variety of different places, just to get a feel for whatever that looked like. My parents moved to LA, and they had lived all over the country, at least on the western side of the country. And so by the time that I met up with them, I was had more capacity to sort of access, the idea of leaving, the idea of sort of being curious, and just trying to attempt things that I didn't know what they meant or what they felt like. And so I didn't know if I had, like, what I would say, the true direction, but I just had an idea that these things would be helpful in the long run. So, I did work for the Forest Service for about 5 years, and it could have become a pathway for me as a professional, in working, in the Fed for a very long time. And then also with, culinary school, when I went to culinary, or when I went to the culinary path, I did go to culinary school. I didn't like it, so I left, and I just started cooking all over the East Coast. And that was a lot of fun. I did, work in Portland, and I was a caterer for the Portland Trailblazers for a few years, and that was a great time. Made some really good connections, and that was really super supportive to sort of knowing a little bit more about, like, what does it look like, long term. And again, just sort of opening up the idea of being curious about what does that future look like. And we'll be talking a little bit about this model that I created in reference to career advising. So, At the center of this is reciprocity. And because the way that we've been thinking and working with our students is that most of our students want to give back to their communities. And so in that dialogue and thinking about it, there are two constructs that sort of, two words, two frameworks, whatever you want to call them, that seemed to emerge in that conversation. And one was values and one was service. So, most of the time when we ask students, like, what do they want to do? They're like, well, I want to work with elders. I want to work with youth. I want to work in healthcare. I want to solve diabetes. So there is a need to do something, and they have that sort of value structure about there's something in here that is guiding them to know, like, where they want to sort of focus their energy. And then, the question of like, well, then how do you want to work with elders, youth, in your attempt to solve diabetes? And that's a lot of the conversation that, we have through this wheel of this sort of circular thinking path that I've created, because, there is a lot of understanding of what giving back looks like and feels like, but there are not a lot of conversations about what does service really mean, and then how does that sort of play out to, help an individual sort of think of their values and things that they want to do for the future. So, I have some questions I ask to sort of get the person grounded, but I'm going to walk through this wheel just so we could get a better idea of some of the things that are happening here. So ways of being are pretty much just the understanding of self. So understanding like how you view the world, what you think of, the environment you live in, knowing the difference between rural, tribal, urban, and just sort of like finding, the things that like I like to, work with water. I enjoy the sun, or, the very simple kind of constructs that sort of make up who you are as an individual. So that's sort of like the exploration of just like, this is who I am and this is what I know about myself. Storytelling is, when we work with students and we have an ambassador program. And one of the things that I think is really powerful, and the takeaway from that, is that when we work and we talk to the students, the main focus of that is to teach them how to be really good storytellers. So when they start to talk about themselves, they usually talk about the detrimental, they talk about the severe, the desperate, and they have a really good, in-depth conversation with themselves about how horrible life is. But what we try to do during that time is to sort of get them to focus on, okay, well, your life has been horrible to this point. Struggles are pretty intense, but you're here. And tell me a little bit about what you've learned about yourself. Like, what have you learned in general? Like, how have you been able to, get up and go to school? How have you been able to raise your family? How have you been able to sort of put food on the table even sometimes? And what are you thinking of, like, who you are when you think of the now versus the then? Because, you carry a lot of that weight with you, but we also want to know, like, acknowledge some of your strengths, your capacities, the things that you do to sort of make it, in quotes, more solid of a path for you. And then, when we get into the relationality component, that's where you sort of examine, like, this is what I know about myself, and this is what I think I want to know better. I know that I like water, but I don't know, to what degree I want to study it. You ask, why do you like water? Well, there could be two things. One, it's very important to my people. Two, I like being in it and it makes me feel happy. So then now the question becomes, okay, well, like, what type of water makes you the happiest? And you're like, I don't know. So maybe you should go and be in rivers. Maybe you should go be in lakes. Maybe you should go be in the ocean. Maybe you should go be in water and space. I don't know. It just depends on how you want to build that construct of knowing and not knowing. And that can happen in any ways. Like, I love to cook, but I don't know how to cook lobster. So maybe I'll go to Maine and learn how to do that. Or I like to cook. I'm Navajo, but I don't know how to butcher a sheep. So maybe I'll go to New Mexico and be on the res for a while to learn how to butcher a sheep. And that's all sort of the context of sort of like growing out of your skin, out of yourself. And so people do this naturally, but they don't realize that they're putting themselves and challenging themselves and sort of growing edifying their next steps. And then the ways of knowing, and this is critical because I have research here, but the way that we have sort of seen it emerge in our working with students and with the tribal colleges, universities, is that ways of knowing is more about the sharing of knowledge versus the actual sort of like demonstration that I know. And so, you find out things and you learn things, and your responsibility to some degree, and sometimes the basic sort of need for people is like, I want to share what I know. And so the ways of knowing, manifests itself by, the way that I know this is that I'm sharing it with you in this way. I have a knowledge of like going to school. I want to be helpful to that. I have a knowledge of, water. And I want to tell you about the water that I know. And in that, you're sort of edifying, you're building a pathway, you're building the support system. And then it sort of edifies something about you. And then you become a water person. And then in that, it goes back to the ways of being. And this circle, in the circle here, I've also acknowledged, not in this image, but there are always decisions and factors that sort of play into like what we call the little deaths, where individuals have to let go of stuff. And as they let go of stuff, there's a fracturing of that individual to some degree. But as they work through and they begin to do, work towards reflection and sort of think critically about like, what is the takeaway? Who am I now that this is no longer here? There's healing. So it's always sort of a constant flow of, dying and letting go, and then, regenerating and healing. And that's always a part of this whole process as you move through, in quotes, life. And that's a part of like what this is about, is that it's not necessarily about just a career path. It's more about, as you grow and learn and you become more aware of who you are and what you want to do, like that becomes your sort of career path. And so it's not about becoming a long-term, doctor, in quotes. That could happen, but it's more about like, I want to heal. And that could be a variety of different ways of healing. As you are, in your 20s and your 30s, 40s, and 50s, all of these ideas and frameworks of healing could change for you. So as I talk about reciprocity, here are some basic questions, and I'll be walking through these. I'm going to ask them, give you just a couple of seconds to reflect, think about it, and sort of know, like, what does this really mean? So I gave you some examples of like, what do you know about yourself? These are the values. Like, I like to, more pragmatically, I like to work in the mornings. I like to work with elders. I like to work with animals. I don't want to leave the res. Those are things that are really powerful and should be a part of your decision-making factors as you grow. But know that they're not going to be the same always. They could change. And then service, like, what do I want to give back? I want to give back to elders because they give so much, or I want to give back to elders because nobody's taking care of them in this way. I want to give back to animals because nobody seems to be helpful here, and you can pinpoint some of the things about your realities enough to sort of like give it some more, in quotes, flesh, or give it a little bit more material substance, and sort of thinking about where and what is it that you want to give back, and then what makes you happy. And I talked about water. Water makes me happy, but then what type of water? Again, like, is it lakes? Is it rivers? Is it oceans? Is it water in space? And then, like, how can you describe what is happiness in that? Is it just sort of being in it? Is it looking at it? Is it sort of learning about it? Is it sort of drinking it? You can build any number of things from that, to sort of describe how this sort of plays out for the long-term thinking. And then what motivates and energizes you? Back to water, being in it. I like to drink it. I like to study it. These things are, each of those are action items, and each of them sort of play into the way that they make you feel. So you get to sort of know a little bit more by just sort of understanding your own feeling, your own capacity to do something. I like to eat, therefore I want to cook, and I like to cook green chili enchiladas. So I'm going to go somewhere where I can cook green chili enchiladas. And then you make the decision to sort of show up there and decide on, is this a career path, a professional path, or is this just something that I want to do because I like to eat enchiladas? Here is another thing that another three questions that I think are pretty powerful. And I'm going to go back to referring to Corey because he sort of demonstrated this in a very fun way, where his initial intent was to sort of be a scientist, and I don't think he had a really good idea of like, what do I want to give back to the world. But as he began to sort of think critically about what do I want to give back in reference to science and sort of understand, and then having his own findings sort of validated, like there was something that was really critical about like the knowledge that I could find and bestow upon the world in reference to sort of studying black holes. I don't think he was going out to sort of endeavor to sort of prove or demonstrate anything, but when he did, sort of add a little bit of depth and knowledge to Einstein's theory of gravitational waves, like, there was something about that. And then when you think about your community, I don't think that the community was too far from his heart, because when he got to that moment of discovery, he was like, we could add something even more specific to this in reference to the world. But thinking about my community, we could, create new words, think about how this impacts the Blackfeet community in general, thinking about science, thinking about like the way that I think as a Blackfoot person. So there is something really critical about understanding, and as that you grow, you become more capable of understanding what community means enough to sort of know, like, this is how I could give back. And then his mother stepped into that too. So I think that that's a really critical part too, is that, when you begin to sort of open up and sort of think about like, I can influence this, other people may join to be a part of, giving that, being a part of the giving story for you. And then, I don't know if there was something in it for him, but when, he probably started off with, I like the stars. And I think that it would be great for me to spend the rest of my life looking at the stars. And so the enjoyment in looking at stars was probably the beginning of a long, trajectory of becoming this, world famous scientist. So just think about some of those things and give yourself a little bit more, I'll say, grace, leeway, freedom to just sort of think about like, what does this really mean for me? If I mean, even in your, maybe your state of being, if you're younger or older. And as we get into the model, as I said before, ways of being are pretty much the self-awareness, understanding who you are, understanding like what you know of your world, understanding like what your worldview is. There are many ways of sort of thinking about it. We use words like Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal, Lakota, Navajo, even like growing up in the mountains versus, in the valley, growing up in rural, growing up in urban areas, growing up on the res. All of those are really interesting constructs that we add to this knowledge of who we are. And then when you get into yourself, like, I like ketchup and I don't like ketchup. Knowing even some of those basic things is a very important part of this. I like water. I like to live near water. I want to live in cold. I want to live in heat. These things are so critical to sort of thinking about like, what does this look like? But then, getting into that understanding of how does it sort of play out when you're thinking about the ways that you want to show up in a professional sense. Something I think that's really critical is sort of knowing your main interests and then knowing your main values. My interests are to work with water, to work with animals, like I said before, and then the values are, I want to be respectful. I want to learn how to be respectful. I want to be more able to give back. I want to be able to tell a story. All of these things play a very critical part of thinking about what does this look like for the long term. We have a tool called Focus 2, and you can click on this link here, go in and build a profile. And then once you take a couple of inventories, they have a self-awareness and personality test, and then they also have a work interest test. And from those, they will the tool will sort of share information about jobs that sort of showed up and how you answered and responded to some of the questions. And it's a starting point, and then you begin to sort of take it from there to understand, like, okay, well, I'm interested in education, but do I want to work in elementary again? Do I want to work with youth? I'm interested in education, but I have a need to work with older people. So what does that look like when I think about education? So all of this sort of ties in together as you become more honest and sort of share your true thoughts about who you are and then where you want to go. Then we get into storytelling, because I think that this is probably one of more difficult parts of this journey of becoming a professional. Is like, I'll start with this because I think that this is super powerful. If it feels like bragging, it probably is. One of my former students shared that as she was talking to a group of Alaska Native students at the Elders and Youth Conference up in Alaska. And there's something really critical about understanding, like, if it's a story about the things that you do, the things that you like to do, and the things that you're capable of doing, that those are really powerful things, because I think too, I'll harness it even more, and something that she's added, we as Native people believe that you're here for a reason. And the way that you kind of come to in fruition is that you learn, you do things, and then you demonstrate, you have thoughts, and then you share those thoughts with people. And as you begin to share and sort of know a little bit more about like how the world works and is connected, like those things become important to your storyline. And also, I think that you're given gifts and you're given talents, and you've got skill sets, even though you can learn them and even though you have some innate ones. Talking is a skill. Talking really well is something that you learn. Talking so well that you can convince people to do things, even more of a developed skill. So just think about that when you're talking about, or referring to who you are as a person, because you have a capacity to talk, but can you do it so well that you can do something, sell a car, upsell at a restaurant, be very helpful to get someone to understand that this is our menu and you can order these items and this is where you need to go next. So all of these things are really critical when you're thinking about that storyline that you want to tell. So personal statement is when you are describing a little bit of who you are in reference to higher education. So this is who I am. This is what I know. This is what I don't know. And I think that your institution can be helpful for me in doing this. Elevator speech, super simple. I am Jack Soto. I like to cook. I travel the country to cook. I am here, at this conference to do X, Y, and Z because I am ready and prepared to do this, whatever that looks like. Resumes are very succinct, departmentalized sort of thinking about who you are. So you'll have, really nice chunks of information of who you are based upon job, education, and other talents or responsibilities that you've taken on. You can add, I've been a coach, I have been student body president, into your resume, but you can also sort of be more succinct in reference to like, I've gone to these schools, I went to Harvard, I went to community college, I went to this high school, I went to this state, whatever. So you to see those pictures, and then getting into the language of your job descriptions, like, you're going in and saying like, I was an executive director, I was counter help. And those are very powerful pieces for people to see. And then you go into, something I think that's pretty helpful about that language is thinking, again, not to brag or distill any of the language. Like, I counter help. I talked to, I took orders to help people understand our menus. And, I have really strong communication skills because I did this. Counting drawers, counting change, basic accounting in reference to sort of taking on the responsibility of sort of being a cashier. So there are any number of ways to describe some of the things that you're doing, as opposed to sort of just saying like, I took orders. Great, but you could be describing a little bit more about what really happens inside of you when you took that order. Like, you had to learn the menu. Even cleaning. Cleaning is another part of just sort of like the construct of organization, making sure that the place is comfortable, appealing, being able to sort of manage aesthetics by ensuring that, the place looks clean, making sure you restock stuff so that people have it readily available, another part of organization. So all of these play a really critical, portion to your narrative as you begin to walk through it. Relationality. Um, I'll stop there. So let me stop sharing here, and then I'll go to the other screen to see if there are any questions. Anybody have any questions or thoughts, or have anything that they'd like for me to delve deeper into? Ashley, how do I impact my opportunities to fit my preferred or chosen career path, especially when opportunities other than preferred career keep being presented? Being offered a lot of environmental focused opportunities, but not many medical ones. Medicine is my preferred career. Well, that's a very great question. So this gets kind of into where we're going to go with relationality. And so what I think that, is pivotal in helping that sort of come to fruition. And I'm going to say it this way because I think it's really, really powerful. If you put it out in the universe, then the universe will learn how to find you. So if you are interested in medical opportunities, there are two things. You should be telling people that you're looking for medical opportunities, and you should be going into medical places that medical opportunities exist. And that doesn't have to be physical. The fun thing about our world today is that we're so connected, and we have Google, we have a variety of different, tools. I'll talk a little bit about Connect here in a minute. You can have conversations with people about a variety of different things without having to build a strong relationship. So when I say mentor, I don't necessarily feel like you need to go in and work with someone for like months or years, but you could go in and just sort of say, "Hey, Dr. So and so, I have an idea of I'm interested in epidemiology in reference to sort of HIV, or epidemiology in reference to data on stats of youth between the ages of 8 and 12 in reference to diabetes structures." If you have an idea of like what you're interested in and what you're doing, then that becomes a part of like you sharing with the world what it is that you're interested in. And it's okay to tell people, like, when they say, here's an environmental science, opportunity, you could say like, I like it, but it would be better if it was, is there a health focus in there? Or is there somewhere where I can look for health, opportunities, or finding people who could be connected? I mean, and that's us. I mean, Ashley, like if you let us know that you're looking for that, we could be helpful to some degree. We may not sort of put you right directly with the right thing that fits, but there are other associations, out there that are looking to find youth to participate in some of the things that they do. The Association of Native American or American Indian Physicians is one. There are a number of different medical opportunities that exist throughout the country. If you're looking to go into surgery, you could just start, Googling residencies, medical residencies for Native Americans. Like, where are those? Are there programs? Is there any sort of training? Thinking about that too. So, I mean, and I think that's sort of like the starting point. And this is kind of like what this is really helping you, is that it's not necessarily that you're going to find the right one, because medical study and long-term endeavor, like you do a number of different things to get exposed to something that makes sense to you. So was that helpful, Ashley? Right, great. I'll go back to the share screen again. So, and to Ashley's question, this is sort of the thing that I think is really powerful. Now that I know that I want to do medical opportunities, I begin to tell people, and I begin to sort of understanding, like, what is it that I want to know? Do I want to go into to be a surgeon? Do I want to be, a physical assistant? Do I want to be someone who works in research? When you start to sort of do some of that investigation, it helps sort of like clarify a little bit more for you to know, like, oh, who do I need to talk to? Well, where do I need to surface and what do I need to know? And then I'm pointing to Connect because Connect is our network tool. And if you go in there, you have an opportunity of finding people who are in the medical field. If you can, you can let me know and we can figure it out. But, again, there are people that we have reached out to who are native and non-native who are willing to help and chat for these conversations don't have to be, again, like hours on end. And sometimes they don't even have to be in person. If you can connect to someone just in text or even in virtually in virtual spaces, this allows you to sort of begin to sort of think about the conversation that you want to have. Like, I'm curious about becoming a surgeon. I'm curious about researching diabetes. I'm curious about, I'm forgetting the name of orthopedics. It just depends on any number of things that you're trying to figure out, like, what is it that I want to know? Because if you can figure that out, again, you'll want to sort of put yourself into environments that sort of can edify your understanding and give you a better, way of sort of thinking about it. Because I have here integrating reflection into decision making and trust building, which equals self and others. So when you are digging deeper into your own capacity to become something, you need others to be helpful. You need experiences. You need to sort of understand that the only way you'll ever sort of know is through that experience. And that is sort of doing what Ashley sort of put out, is that there are a lot of opportunities available. But it's not so much I'm picky and choosy. It's more about, like, I just know my path. And I want to be able to do that. And then if you let's say, Jack Soto is your coach here at the College Fund, you're just like, well, I'm gonna let Jack know. And then Jack then can look at some of our full team to say, like, who do we know within this pocket of resources that we have with employers that may be willing to sort of connect. Then you have a conversation with that person. Short one. Doesn't, again, have to be long. Doesn't have to be a mentoring relationship. You can start calling the mentor if you like, but you have to know that a mentoring relationship is a back and forth, and it could be continuous. Then you sort of like tell us, like, okay, well, now I know I want to do research. And then, we have opportunities where we could fund some of that research deep dive or exploration enough to sort of help you sort of know, like, oh, this is not what I want to do. I am. There's a couple examples because I used to run internship. Well, I run some internship programs to help build them, at least I should say. But I ran an internship program, and many of the students who came were Native students who are coming into DC for public service, predominantly working within the feds and trying to figure out, like, okay, so is this a path for me? Most of them didn't know what they wanted to do, but they just did something because they're like, oh, it sounds fun. One student, she was in communications and she was in radio, and she came and the USDA brought her on board to help them build at the beginning of podcasts. And so she was working with them to understand literally, like, pre-podcast world. And I thought that was kind of fun and exciting because she's like, well, I'm basically creating ads, but then I'm also interviewing people throughout the USDA and then sort of like putting it out into the world. And I'm like, how? She's like, well, we're putting it out into YouTube, and we're having these conversations and sort of then plugging and sharing it out with some of our partners. So that was kind of an interesting take on, she's like, and I'm having so much fun doing this, but I'm working for the USDA. Another student, she was an HR student, and she was in her final year, had only a semester to complete, and then came to do HR in one of the agencies and realized, like, oh my God, HR had nothing to do with people. And she was like, I'm a people person. I thought that that's what HR was. And so when she, we had a chat about it because I was like, well, HR is big, and there are a number of different spaces within that could fit what you want. But when she went into the HR, environment, she learned a little bit more about like this may not be a path for me. And she's like, but I don't want to start out over. And I'm like, no, you're not going to. You're going to finish your degree, then you're going to go out into the world and figure out like, how do I tell you what it is that I'm looking for? And that becomes a huge part of sort of understanding like, how do I need to show up? And then, the next iteration, or the next in quote step, or the next, space that you sort of find yourself is, one of the things I told that student was like, you should be sharing this knowledge more with people. And she's like, what, that HR is not about people? I'm like, that would be super cool. And she's like, it would be very helpful. She goes, it would be, now that you've told me that there are a number of different ways of showing up in the world in reference to HR, she's like, I think I should also be helpful to that. But I think that, sort of like once you know the landscape, I'm a student who is interested in helping people find jobs. I have gone to school. I am, I've applied to an internship and I was reviewed and I was brought on board to learn a little bit more, because I think that's something too that people don't realize about internships, is that they're not built to help you demonstrate your knowledge. They're built for you to learn how to do something, learn how to be a professional, learn how to work with others. So those are environments that are not, built for you to just sort of like say that I know what I'm doing, because you may have some skills, but you also are going to be edifying and learning a little bit more about how does this really sort of make me feel, and what do I know I can and cannot do within these environments. And then so when you know that, that becomes the responsibility then of yourself to sort of lean into the experience of, I could teach people about these pathways, I could tell them about these programs, I can tell them about what I learned, but I also could sort of be helpful in just sort of leading them down that pathway of, HR is not about people. So if you're in this field, think again. And then you work with people who are coming to you and asking you how to do better about decision making. So then you know what have I learned, and then what can I share. And I think that the fun thing about this is that I've used the word manipulating here, because um, recently we went to Disney and we were visiting one portion that was really amazing about the park. And so we were learning a little bit more about the way Disney sort of does its work beyond just the parks. And there was a gentleman there. His name was Dr. Zach. He studied bugs, and he was a PhD, and he taught for a number of years and did research on bugs and was pretty, well known for that. But when we were chatting with him, he said, like, when I got my PhD finished and I got really tired of working in the academy, um, he goes, I didn't know where to go. And he goes, I don't think that people help us do this, or we don't do it well in this country or in the world in general. He goes, nobody told me that I could be a PhD who studied bugs and worked for Disney. And he was so excited about his job and the things that he was doing. They discovered a small, swarm of butterflies that they thought were extinct in Florida and in the world. And when they found them, they were so, you know, um, excited. And then they began to sort of learn like how to get them to be reintroduced into the world. And he was just talking about endless examples of how Disney was being thoughtful about its research, about its understanding of the ways that, bugs and humans and bugs and animals work. There was another thing too that they learned, that they were trying to figure out like how to stop people from killing elephants. And then they learned that elephants don't like honeybees, and then they decided that they would work with farmers who needed bees to strategically place honeybees around their gardens so that the elephants wouldn't come in and destroy their gardens. Therefore, creating a pollinator landscape ecosystem to be helpful to the growing of the goods, and then also saving animals from being killed, specifically elephants. And so it's just sort of like, you have to be really helpful to yourself to know that this is where I'm at, but this doesn't mean that this is the only thing that it can be. So you've got to learn how to manipulate what you've learned. You've got to learn how to manipulate what you think about the world to get to like promoting your ideas, the things that I think are going to be helpful for my future, or the things that I think are going to be fun and cool that I don't even know. Uh, you, you could think about like what type of what can I put into a tortilla shell to create a different type of enchilada? I heard about a salmon enchilada and I was like, that doesn't sound, or a salmon tamale. And I'm like, that does not sound good to me. But I'm not a person who eats salmon. I'm not a person who likes fish. I'm not a person who thinks that fish is good or bad in Mexican food. But it was just one of those things that I was like, But years ago, I put blue cheese into an enchilada pie that I made, and it was amazing and people loved it. But it's just sort of figuring out like, how do you get to a place of where you are allowing yourself to be exploratory and then teaching more people how to go with you down that path. And then as I said, like this whole system and this approach, it doesn't end, in every iteration. And every time you find yourself, you move from one job to another. When I think about the progression into becoming a chef, there's fast food, there is, mid-range restaurants, there's fine dining, and then there's also sort of catering, and then there's, a deep dive into a specific cuisine and sort of then practice. So you can see that. And at every iteration, you're going to have to go through the same process of understanding, like, who am I? What do I want to tell and know? What do I not know? How do I want to find the opportunity to sort of dig deeper into it? And then how do I get to the point of being able to tell more people about this path so they can sort of be a part of this with me? And that just is a huge, that plays a huge role throughout just sort of becoming a professional over time. So I'm going to stop sharing and stop talking for a little bit. Get back here and see if there are any other questions or thoughts. Any other questions or thoughts about what I've shared so far? I actually was burning through that, so I have a little bit of time, I believe. And as I mentioned, or I didn't mention this process is not necessarily about sort of going down a path of how do I create an employment plan, or what am I thinking of sort of getting to the point of like finding the job for me. Like there are so many opportunities as you grow as a person and as an individual that you need to allow yourself some capacity to sort of be curious. There was a question too that in the last session about how do I work with a student who has 5 different career paths or interests. You let them you find ways of letting them explore each of those career paths and interests. If you have, a list of 30, pick 4 or 5 and then do some research, because there are jobs, one, that are available, but there are also jobs that are not even created yet, which I still think that people forget is, we move constantly into ways that are always needed. Many of the things that I, heard from just sort of that short visit with Disney is that the things that they did, well, the way that they have sort of currently, well, the way that they got to the point of where they currently exist was done a lot by accident. They had a need of understanding how do we use all of our food waste. And so they built a whole sustainability, construct to be supportive to that, which is, we'll learn how to compost. We'll learn how to do this. And they realize like, oh, we have animals, and we could feed them with our old food. And as they begin to sort of think about this, they have all of these other crazy, departments and pathways to exploration and references sustainability, and they incorporate them in all of their their um, their parks. I was really surprised to learn that Walt Disney World in there are 4 parks, and they have a solar farm, 2 solar farms, and from those 2 solar farms, they are able to cover 70% of all of their energy used. And that is really fascinating to me. But again, like, they didn't start off that way. And so, when we think about the way that the world is working, there's a necessity to sort of consider, what does a remote workforce look like moving forward for tribes? Because I think that, they're going to have access to broadband, but yet we have a whole bunch of people who haven't had broadband in years, and they're going to have to learn how to, manifest that environment using their computers as a very specific way of sort of driving, work, thinking of employment. We use them for school, but we have a whole nother workforce that's out there that hasn't learned how to use these for school. I'm in my 50s, and I have a friend, and she's in her 60s, and her niece asked her, like, how old were you when you got your first cell phone? And the response was like, they didn't even have cell phones when I was your age. So people forget that, this technology that we're using has not been here for all of that long. And it's constantly changing. So there's always too, there are great jobs out there that haven't even been discovered. And you could be a part of, like, understanding, like, what does that need look like? I'm going to read that comment, Ashley. Sorry. Love that. Great point. There are jobs where you are able to provide new ideas or areas to add to your job description and duties. And that's another thing too. Like, if you're not really sure about a job, I'll refer to our focus too. You could go in and look at jobs again to see what kind of jobs are available in health, and what kind of jobs are available in medical, what kind of jobs are available in education. You could Google that same stuff when you're thinking about, like, when I'm redesigning or updating my resume for a specific job. Like, you could Google, teacher, professor, and it'll give you really good outlines and good starting points to sort of build something that could be helpful for what you're wanting to sort of do for your resume. So, are there any other additional questions? Again, I ran through that pretty quickly. I'm looking at the schedule, and I think that I still have a little bit of time. So, if there are thoughts, okay, well, we are at time, and come again tomorrow. If you have any other questions, you can feel free to send them to me. I will. I see there's one question that popped up in the field below, but this is my email if you have any additional questions. What would you say is your definition of service? Well, I mean, for me, and it's more of a construct than anything else. It's um, giving back, period. And that doesn't mean it has to happen in a specific way, because you can give back in so many ways. You can give back, when we're thinking of the construct of giving back, you could do it, and you can do it as an artist. You can do it as a researcher. You can do it as a person who is in a field that no other natives are in. You can do it more pragmatically by actually sort of, taking on a role within the federal agencies, within the states, within, a leadership position. So, and even just sort of like going in and being a social worker, you're actually in there doing work, in quotes, that is service. So there's not a lot of structure around the idea of what service is. And that's the whole point, because when you're working with someone to sort of help them be 2 things, exploratory and to make decisions about their future, you don't limit it. You don't put it into, this is what it needs to look like, because then you're limiting their scope of understanding, like, who am I here? Because I have a need to sort of work with animals, but I don't know how to be of service to the community. One of my students, she found that her tribe had a wild horse herd and nobody was lined up to take care of them. So she found it was her responsibility as a member of that community to take on the ownership and lead of preserving those wild horses and that farm. And so then she was like, I need to learn how to write grants. I need to learn like who do I talk to? Who else has wild horse farms? And that became her idea of service to her community. But it wasn't an act that she said, I'm going to go in and I'm going to, be Mother Teresa about it and heal the sick. Is that helpful, Elena? All right, great. Well, thank you all again and have a wonderful afternoon, evening, and hopefully you'll be here tomorrow. I appreciate your time and energy, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions. Thank you.